Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris and I am immediate past president of the City Club's Board of Directors. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Jim Wallis, Chief Executive Officer of Sojourners. Mr. Wallis appears today as part of the City Club's Encore Speakers Forum and last spoke at the City Club in October 1996 on the topic, Who Speaks for God? He is well known and highly respected for his thought leadership on the topic of the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I think a timeless topic, but also a particularly hot one in this, a general election year, and also as the nation recovers from the financial crisis and discusses and debates how best to avoid a recurrence. Mr. Wallis started his journey to his thought leadership status early in life. As a teenager, he observed and questioned racial segregation in his church and community, and as a student participated in the civil rights and anti-war movements. His activism has led to arrests for alleged acts of civil disobedience. While at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, he and fellow students launched a small magazine and community which became known as Sojourners. By 1979, Time magazine recognized Mr. Wallis for his leadership, naming him as one of its 50 Faces for America's Future. Today, Sojourners has a combined print and electronic media readership in excess of 250,000. As stated at its website, Sojourners' mission is, quote, to articulate the biblical call to social justice, inspiring hope and building a movement to transform individuals, communities, the church, and the world, end quote. And as further stated, Sojourners' strategic commitments, quote, are faith and action in three strategic areas: racial and social justice, life and peace, and environmental stewardship, end quote. In furtherance of that mission and strategic focus, Mr. Wallis has written and spoken frequently and internationally and advised presidents from both of the leading political parties. He recently served on President Obama's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships and currently serves as chair of the Global Agenda Council on Faith for the World Economic Forum. Mr. Wallis teaches a course on faith, social justice, and public life at Georgetown University and previously taught at Harvard University. In addition to his many books, the latest of which is Rediscovering Values on Wall Street, Main Street, and Your Street, a moral compass for the new economy. He's also a frequent columnist for major newspapers and commentator on radio and television, having appeared on Meet the Press, Hardball, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and The O'Reilly Factor, among other programs, and also on National Public Radio. Finally, a few personal notes on our speaker. His spouse was one of the first women ordained in the Church of England and is an author, and his diverse talents have led him to the baseball field where he has served, and I understand continues to serve, as a Little League baseball coach. I am pleased to present on behalf of the City Club of Cleveland, Jim Wallis, Chief Executive Officer of Sojourners.
Thank you, Paul, Jim, Gary, old friends like Lynn I see around the room. It's great to be back, and I asked how old you all were, and 100 years is coming up, and that's the oldest, longest continuing City Club forum in the country. Let's give the City Club a hand here. That's pretty impressive, and I'm honored to be part of that long list of people that you've had. The baseball coach thing, I want to start with a story that happened on Saturday. I coached my older son Luke. He's way beyond me now. He's middle school and he'll be playing high school baseball soon. But Jack is my young son. He's 9, and I'm coaching his team. So we had a game on Saturday, and this is a very young team in the league, and so we had lost 2 close games, and so they were hoping to win a game. And we were down 5-0 in the 4th inning. We only played 6. And so I'm coaching first base, and the top of the lineup has just not hit the ball again, you know. And we were missing plays and making errors, and so the bottom of the lineup is up, and that usually means we're going to be in trouble. And the bats came alive with the kids at the bottom of the lineup. A couple of them walked, and then the kid, who probably is the worst player on the team, he's never played baseball, he has not a clue about baseball, His parents are from the UK, and they said, he should play baseball. And they don't know a thing about baseball, like my wife did. Now she's a baseball commissioner, though. This kid hits the ball, and he gets a double. He's never seen the ball go that way before. And he knocked in the first 2 runs of a rally, and we won the game 11-6. And he got the game ball. He got to second base, and he began to walk off the base and shake hands with the shortstop. Second baseman. I said, Stephen! He said, oh, I said, you gotta stay on the base. He said, oh, I've never been here before. And none of us expected this to happen. It was an unexpected result. We had a team meeting afterwards, and the kids went on and on about, how excited they were about what they did, and they were proud of each other and backslapping, and we became a team on Saturday. And it got me thinking about the unexpected, how we need. I was worried about how much we were going to lose. Our 3rd loss. And they came back, and we won a game. I think we need some unexpected interventions in what we call politics. We need the unexpected now. We're in serious trouble without it. Tim King and my team at Sojourners has just put together a great video. Tim is our communications director, and I came back from a 3-month sabbatical. I was away. I had nothing to do with this. But I came back and I saw this. I was very impressed by it, and he's going to start. It's a very brief video thing we launched just last week. And this will show, I think, some unexpected hope for politics. Tim.
I'm voting in this election, but it's not for a candidate and it's not for a party.
I'm voting for my church.
I'm voting for my friend Gene.
So we still have the resources to serve my city's homeless population.
So that this is his last tour of duty.
I'm voting for the next generation.
I'm voting for my 2nd graders.
I'm voting for my future children.
So that they have a cleaner planet than I have.
So that they get the quality education that they deserve.
So that they can grow up in a nation where we overcome poverty through opportunity for all.
I'm voting for health, for a consistent ethic of life.
I'm voting for every child who's been trafficked or sold.
And the freedom of women everywhere.
Because human beings are never property.
I'm voting for my friend Anna.
I'm voting for the world's poorest 1 billion people.
So that by the time she graduates high school, she will be judged on her character, not her immigration status.
Our voice is our vote, and it's not for sale.
Not to a candidate, not to a party, and not to a super PAC. Our values count, our voices matter.
This November, we're not voting for a candidate or a party.
We're voting for us.
Like that? Well, I came back from the sabbatical, and it's one of the first things I saw. Some of these are our interns, some are young people around Washington. But really, it ties into what we actually were at Georgetown this week for the release of a new poll on the millennials. And it shows how a new generation is much more unaffiliated than their parents, and in different kinds of categories. They're unaffiliated from religion. They don't necessarily have the same as their parents, and politics. And it's interesting how that could, I think, reconfigure politics, which needs reconfiguring. You look at the Tea Party and Occupy, 2 movements that were originally outside of politics that are changing, influencing politics. There clearly is a decline of traditional political organizations. Parties, they're not voting for candidates, parties, super PACs. We're calling this the post-candidate politics. I like that phrase, post-candidate politics. The structures are in decline. Loyalty of parties is in decline. But what will take its place? What will take the place of the declining political structures and organizations? I think one of 2 things. Either the overwhelming power of money, which will control everything more and more from now on, or what we're going to call here new social movements and social media, like Occupy, Tea Party, new social movements and social media that tell stories, lift up ideas, and really, when you listen to them, they're voting for people, for friends, for principles, for values, for stories. And what will take the space of declining institutions is really a critical question before us. Now, I am a person of faith, and some of you may be, and some of you may not be. But I think there is some theology of politics that I think is helpful here that I want to say a little bit about. And I'm looking forward to our conversation together. I want to lift up a phrase called the idolatry of politics. Politics has become an idol in America, I think, and this election will dramatically demonstrate our idolatry of politics. People of faith should never worship at the altar of politics, because we worship God, and the kingdom of God is not the same as the kingdoms of politics. And the worship of God should shape our life as people of faith and our engagement with politics, not the other way around. Left and right, for example, are not religious categories. They are political categories. And when we try to squeeze religion into those categories, religion gets misshaped and distorted and becomes something different than what it's supposed to be. I think that was a fundamental mistake, purpose, practice of the religious right to identify faith with one political party, the Republican Party, and that was, I want to suggest, idolatry from the beginning. But efforts to counter that by a much smaller religious left, much smaller, that begin to be a mirror image of the religious right and engage in some of the same practices with the Democrats, that's the same theological mistake. So I started this 3-month sabbatical by entering into solitude and silence with some monks on the west coast of California, the Camaldolese, total silence and solitude, which for me, in the noise of my life, was quite a change. And nothing happened, nothing punctuated the day except for lauds, vigils, Eucharist, and Vespers. I ended up bumping into, on the kitchen library in the guest monastery there, the Narnia Chronicles, which I hadn't read for a long time. And I began to read them all the way through again. It was a powerful kind of experience for me. I kind of began to rethink politics because of a lion named Aslan. And I've written about this in the book. I don't want to go into it much now, but I want to say that Aslan exemplifies and defends Narnia's common good, making every judgment, decision, and action on behalf of the people and their land for the best of all, but always paying special attention to the littlest, the weakest, the most vulnerable. He's the living teacher that mentors everyone on how to find a good and more peaceful life and land. I could say more about that, but I won't today. The time away and the walking the mountains and the hills, sometimes when Aslan was at my side, solidified my hope to write a biblical and theological defense of the common good. Len knows a lot about that from his Catholic theology. I think that common good has almost disappeared in American political life, in our age of selfishness, I think on all sides of the political aisle. And I would say, yes, we need better public policies. I've advocated for them for many years. But the deepest need, I think, is more spiritual than political in seeking a redemptive path forward. It's time to move beyond our superficial and, we have to say now, hateful politics and media. I get calls from both sides of the aisle, members of Congress, who say, it really is worse than it's ever been. We used to know each other, spouses and kids, and we'd have dinner and drinks, and we'd vote against each other this week, but next week we're voting together on something. Now, everything is just locked down. Extremes control the conversation. And people literally aren't talking to each other as they pass each other in the hallway on Capitol Hill. I think it's time to dig down to deeper places that would renew our faith, clarify our ethical priorities, and really set the moral compass we don't have now for our economy and politics. And I think this 2012 election is going to be the ugliest in years. Get ready. Here it comes. The amount of money that will be spent without any transparency will just fuel the politics of attack and should teach us that you can't put values back into politics until you take the money out of politics. I would suggest to you today that the check writers now control the law writers of Washington, D.C. And the super PACs which will dominate this year's politics are the real enemies of democracy. We had this primary season 1 or 2 billionaires who individually decided which candidates would be viable and how long they'd be viable. And I really be provocative here and say, I know there's lawyers in the room, I'm sure, City Club. I want to suggest that the principle enunciated by the Supreme Court in Citizens United and repeated by candidates, that corporations should now be treated as people, I want to suggest is a theological error, a theological mistake, and indeed a form of idolatry. Idolatry is when something takes the place of God. And now the ultimate importance that the parties and most of the candidates attach to their own electoral victories is a sign, a blatant sign of that idolatry. For example, we were talking in the office before the session here. The conservative right and the Republicans won't be content to just say where they disagree with the policies of Barack Obama. Now, I disagree with policies of Barack Obama, even though I've known him and advised him. It's fine to disagree. That's what democracy is. Disagreement is a good thing. Policies, directions, it's a good thing. They will, in fact, caricature and demonize him as a person. They've already called him the worst, quote, most dangerous, quote, president in history, planning radical changes to America and conducting a war on religion, as Tim said over lunch. And then they say he's done nothing. How can you do nothing and be the most radical president in history? It's difficult to figure that out. All of that is ridiculous. It's politics. And it's idolatrous in placing such ultimate value on what has been in the Obama administration and likely will be mostly very incremental changes in a very broken system. There hasn't been much big done or will be done in this broken system. To call that so ultimate is foolish and idolatrous. Meanwhile, the liberal left and Democrats will say that Barack Obama did everything he could possibly have done to pursue our values. Just those horrible Republicans who blocked the change we can believe in. That's equally ridiculous. And overestimates how much has or will change in the context of such a flawed political process that neither political side is prepared to confront on the basis of deeper moral values and principles like the common good, for example. Neither side has taken. And let me just say, those who campaigned on change and reform and transforming our political process and system in 2 years were privately saying in the White House, quote, we didn't know how broken this system was. We had no idea. We didn't understand how money controls everything. We had no idea. So we decided to just accept the broken system and work with it and try to get a few things done. And that was their mistake. That's when they should have had the A. Philip Randolph conversation with FDR, the Martin King conversation with Lyndon Johnson. Should have brought in social movements. Said, we can't make a change on the inside unless we have a change on the outside. Let's work together, outside, inside dance. But they didn't do that. And politics in Washington, D.C. has no sense of the fact that movements are what change politics. And let me go further here. In Washington, D.C., the means and the end of politics is power. Power is the means, and power is the end. I wrote a book called God's Politics. I would say God's politics focus on the powerless. The powerless, who are especially irrelevant during election years. Politics for Democrats is about power. But God says politics should be about the powerless. I was asked by NPR yesterday before I came here, who would Jesus vote for? It's a wonderful media question, you know. Who would? And I said, he would vote for the powerless in an election year. That means, for people of faith, I think, it means caring most about what happens to the poor and vulnerable. When both parties are going to focus on middle-class voters and wealthy donors. That's all they're going to care about in this election year, both sides. It means actually protecting human life and dignity and promoting the real health and well-being of families instead of just substituting rhetorical devices around hot-button issues to get votes on both sides, pro-life, pro-choice, pro-anti-gay politics. Rhetorical devices to get votes, not efforts to actually solve problems. I've often said in Washington, D.C., the politicians, they all do the same thing. They take a problem and they do two things. They want to make us afraid of it and then blame it on the other side. They all do it. Make us afraid of it and blame it on the other side. They don't try to solve the problem. One of the idolatries of politics is there is no more governing in Washington, ever, even between elections. It's always winning. It's always running for office. There's no more governing going on. So it means lifting up people, for us, I think, who have no political influence, like undocumented immigrants living in the shadows, like low-income families and children who are losing their nutritional and health care support in order to protect the hypocritical subsidies and benefits to the wealthy people who fund political campaigns, period. To those in the poorest countries who will die of malaria, HIV/AIDS, or hunger because of cuts in foreign aid, which isn't popular in an election year. As Mike Gerson, who writes for The Post, worked for George Bush, says, some cuts kill, and these will. It means actually pursuing peace and trying to resolve the international conflicts which continue to divide and kill so many people, instead of bellowing how righteous and strong America is and should always be, so nobody dare challenge us, blah, blah, blah. Elections can make a difference in preventing or producing wars. They really can make that kind of difference. Or protecting or further devastating the poorest and the most vulnerable ones that Jesus called the least of these. In the meeting over the debt crisis we had with the president last summer, I loved, Len, the bishops, the Catholic bishop representing your conference. The president said, Mr. President, our Scripture does not say, as you've done to the middle class, you've done to me. As you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. And the president recalled the text. Elections can lose or gain more fairness and opportunity. But I want to suggest this morning that ultimately, how we live and what we do to serve the common good will be more important than just how we vote, no matter who we vote for. For people of faith, that takes precedence over politics. So I want to just say as I close that I think we have to redefine what politics is. It's not just electoral contests every few years. For a new generation, politics is both a local practice, you know, what they do in their lives, in their neighborhoods, in their communities, in the areas where they work, what they do to practice justice, and then what they advocate nationally for justice. The Greek notion of polis, we all learned in Politics 101 in our civics classes, was not just about electoral politics. It was about the health of the community, the well-being of the whole, the relationships there, what it means. It was about the common good, is what polis really means in the Greek. And in the biblical language, I love shalom. Broken relationships have to be restored and mended and put back together again. That's what politics is, from both a traditional and, I would say, a religious point of view. Elections are part of that. Government's a part of that, but not all of it. So how do we build relations with our neighbor in new ways? I want to suggest, and I'll close with this, three values that people of faith should try and serve in public life, maybe during an election year especially. One, I think the common good has to be upheld in ways we haven't for a long time. And with both parties, it will disappear and be compromised at election time. Two, civility in our public discourse. We need to make a covenant for civility, and we need to demonstrate, lead by example of how we talk about things and candidates and issues. Someone has to demonstrate what civil discourse is. Chuck Colson and I, who just died, Chuck just died, we wrote an op-ed together on civility a couple of years ago. And Chuck and I, our votes at election time usually cancel each other out, and that's fine. But we talked about the importance of how we talk together, particularly as people of faith. And maybe we can find people of faith across political boundaries who might vote differently in the end because of prudential choices, but finally lift up some areas of common ground that they, because of their faith, want to say, we together think this is important. So Richard Land and I of the Southern Baptist Convention, who's a card-carrying member of the religious right, and Richard and I are friends. At the press club a few months ago and then on Morning Joe, we said undocumented people, immigration reform is something we both think is critical for this election year. We said those programs like PEPFAR that are saving lives in sub-Saharan Africa are critical. We both say that, worth the money, worth the expense. And Morning Joe, Joe Scarborough was really surprised. I thought you guys would be fighting. He was saying things that we should all pay attention to. What if we could find a whole list of things like these? And I'll name these and I'll finish. The defense of the poor and vulnerable. That is a religious conviction across political boundaries that all of us should hold up and lift up as a matter for us of faith and not of politics. What happens to the poorest is always our political question. Sure, reducing deficits is a moral issue, but how you do it and who pays the most is a moral issue too. Second, I think we need to focus on, we had this, I can't move around here, we had this, preachers want to move around, but there's a video camera here. We had these two signs at our border with Mexico. One said, "No trespass." The other said, "Help wanted." And 11 million people got stuck between those signs. And those people are in the biblical category of what we call the stranger. And Jesus says, how you treat them is how you treat me. That's what he said. So we across boundaries could lift that up. I want to support policies that actually reduce abortion. Really actually reduce abortion and support strong families. And liberals and conservatives could agree about that. Differ on legal strategies and politics and symbolisms and amendments, but wouldn't we all like to strengthen our families and reduce the number of abortions in America by supporting low-income women in particular? That's what really would make a difference. Couldn't we agree on that? I want to protect religious liberty here and around the world. And I want to promote foreign policies that seek to prevent and resolve inevitable conflicts and not just fueling them. When we fuel conflicts with our religion, we are simply not being who we're supposed to be. I think that could be a powerful thing, and I want to end by saying it is time to reconfigure politics by looking for and to the unexpected. It's time to expand the meaning of politics, and even in an election year, it's time to change politics. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to an encore speakers forum featuring Jim Wallis, Chief Executive Officer of Sojourners. We will return to our speaker in a moment for our traditional City Club question and answers, one of the special traditions of the City Club. We encourage you to start formulating your questions now and would respectfully ask that you keep your questions brief and to the point so we can get as many in as possible. For nearly 100 years, the City Club has celebrated free speech. 4 times throughout our history, the City Club has honored people who have served as symbols of free speech. On May 18, the City Club will honor Ted Turner with our highest recognition, the Citadel of Free Speech Award. This event will be held at noon at Sammy's Metropolitan at 925 Euclid Avenue in Cleveland. To learn more about this and other 100th anniversary events, please visit the City Club website, www.cityclub.org/100. Now we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone here today, including guests. Holding the microphone today is City Club Program Director Kerry Miller. First question, please.
Dr. Wallis, I'm Larry Macon from Mount Zion Church, professor at Cleveland State University. I appreciate you being here, and thank you for your excellent lecture and words. Question, I seem to hear you say absence of a moral voice will end up in some kind of chaotic situation. Who would you suggest would be perhaps the 3 moral voices that we need to begin looking at during this 2012 year?
You know, I'm not going to focus on particular names so much as I am encouraged by a new generation. I call them emerging leaders who seem to me to be trying to move beyond the traditional political categories and raise up the values and the people and the principles that are important to me. I think we have focused much more in politics on celebrity than leadership. I think it's part of our problem. And some of the wisest people in the country right now would never consider running for politics because of the nature of the process. I mean, I've had U.S. senators tell me that they have to raise $20,000 per day to win re-election as a U.S. senator. How much time does that take away from governing? Reading the bills you're voting on? Who does that mean you're talking to, listening to, cultivating, spending your time with? I think the system is so broken that it won't fix itself. So when I mentioned before, the people presidents ought to be talking to, I think there has to be some conversation outside of politics with people who are not going to be politically focused in a partisan way, but I would say, from my point of view, more prophetically focused. I think our churches have to be that kind of voice. It's very difficult when our churches sort of fall into line in election years. I mean, I don't know if you'd noticed this or not, but when you look at, for 3 months, I was not speaking or writing or engaging the media at all, as I usually do. I was watching it, though, and I have never felt more depressed about our political discourse in America as I do after 3 months of watching it. And I noticed how the liberal left that was offering critiques of Obama all the way along, at some point it was like a day when MSNBC decided to become the White House press office. And there's no more critical comments of anything to do with this administration from the liberal left, and the conservative right is doing the same thing. It's amazing how Mitt Romney, who's been just trashed by so many conservatives, will just become a hero by next week, And the most important political question of this week, all in the news venues, is who will. Let's spend the next 5 months really having a debate about who Mitt Romney's running mate will be. I mean, is this really the things we should be talking about in American politics? So I would look to a new generation, and I would look to people and voices who are more outside of politics to speak prophetically to it. I'm hoping the churches don't do what politics has just done. The elites, the media spokespeople, those who have their own shows, the consultants, they are rallying around their side. Why? To protect their access, their influence, and their incomes in the corrupt present order of things. The churches, my hope and prayer is we don't do that. We don't rally around the kings of politics. We rally around our king and raise different kind of questions. So maybe the churches have to play that role along with the new generation. It might bring some of those kids back to church, actually, if we begin to play that role. Please.
I had the pleasure of listening to you last night, too, and so I'm here to ask a question that seemed really important to have asked last night and maybe was alluded to, and that has to do with the Citizen United decision. And you make the point about people being corporations. And then you made the point about having movements in the country that will counteract something like that. Your point being money is going to determine this election more than any time in our history. But the one thing, and I saw it in the Voting Us presentation by the kids or the younger people, they talk about women and the role that women might have in this particular campaign. It seems to me women have been somewhat marginalized in our country in many respects. And I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that.
It's actually pretty painfully current in the faith community right now. I wrote a piece yesterday called Having the Sisters Back. The Vatican has just cracked down on Catholic women religious. And it's part of this larger cultural conversation that you're referring to. I think it's part of it. And what it reminded me of is vivid memories of years when I was traveling and speaking in the Midwest and the South at very conservative evangelical Christian colleges at the height of the religious right. And for me, it was like walking into a lion's den to speak in those places. I walk into this evangelical school, and there would be a whole row or two of Catholic sisters sitting, who are often wearing their traditional garb, giving me a big smile, and I'd walk up to them and say, "Sisters, welcome. What are you doing here? This isn't your normal place or constituency." And they say, "Well, we're local. We're from around here, but we saw you were going to be speaking here, and we thought you ought to have a few people here to be on your side. We're here because we got your back." The nuns were my bodyguards at those things. So I thought, whoever came after me, got to deal with the nuns. And I felt really, really... so I feel like now we got to get the nuns back right now. We got to get their back. My view is Catholic women religious have been the most positive face of the Catholic Church. They have been the best expression of the ministry of Jesus. And and I don't believe, as the bishops suggested, they are the only moral teachers in the church. And I think what they should do is have dialogue and conversation that respects the sisters about their concerns. Control and condemnation is a serious mistake. And the sisters are in a very difficult situation. The rest of us have to speak up in their behalf. At dinner last night, we had a larger question about the role of particularly younger women in politics. You saw younger women are finding their voice and raising their voices, and I think that's going to be, I hope it's more than just they're going to go after both sides, women, Hispanics, young, they're going to go, they all have desks now at their campaign headquarters, so there will be a political outreach to help somebody win, but there are larger issues involved in living with one of the first women ordained in the Church of England 15 years ago. This has been a regular part of our life. So I think my hope is that the expected place of influence is money, and I hope the unexpected place of influence becomes people, new generations, women, his Hispanic voters, people who haven't been as influential in the past, but can be more influential going forward. So I think you're right about that.
Doctor, thank you very much for being here. I've heard a great deal about you, and you have lived up to the expectation all the way. And I look forward to reading your book. You mentioned several times in your talk about the influence or the power of money, and how much more so this is playing a role in the campaigns.
Right.
To what extent do you think turning to having our campaigns publicly funded, and therefore putting limits on the expenditures, would help the cause? If you do, if you don't, I'll hear a reason why. If you do, how do we get a movement started in that direction?
Well, I have sometimes sat down with friends in other countries who are considering running for office. I was with a friend in Australia, and he was considering running for the parliament, the Senate, virtually there. He and his wife and I had a dinner about whether he should, and young kids and being away from home and all that. So finally I said, Tim, what about the money? He said, oh yeah, money it's a big deal. I mean, this race it's going to cost us. It could cost us $25,000, and we don't have that kind of money. So we're going to have to borrow it, and hopefully we can pay it back. I said, how much? And then I told him what it would cost to run for the Senate, and his jaw dropped, and Meredy, his wife, too, and they just said, you'd have to either be very wealthy or be completely dependent on people who are. Exactly right. When I say movement, I don't think this is going to change in my lifetime. You've got to overturn a Supreme Court decision now. You've got to change the whole culture of politics. But this is a movement that I hope a new generation takes up and picks up. And yes, some public financing scheme is necessary. In Britain, where my wife is from, the media is required to do free media time for candidates. So you get to see them actually talking about their policies and their leadership, so just attacking the other side. Now, the problem is it's all moving in our direction, but there are many places around the world where the media has a public obligation to do free. I mean, what the money is mostly going to be spent on is media. And ugly, negative media campaigns. So there's a media dimension to this, there's a public finance dimension to this, and there have been people on both sides of the aisle. John McCain cares about campaign finance. And, I would have loved to have seen the last election between Obama and McCain, who both said they were for this direction, and it didn't happen. And now we're in a much more difficult circumstance. So some kind of public financing, and the media is going to have to play a significant role in that, I think.
Thank you so much for your words. I couldn't agree with them more. But you talked about civility and the common good and us needing to come together for that, and you mentioned A. Philip Randolph, who held elected officials accountable, which I think is sort of the bottom line word for what you're talking about. Held elected officials accountable by helping to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people in Washington, D.C. and make change in that way. Now there's a march every week in Washington, D.C. about niche issues that, frankly, when I see it on the news, I don't really give much thought to anymore. So, I also don't see clicking the like button on Facebook as being a movement either. So can you talk a little bit more about what you see that movement looking like and being, and how I be a part of that? And, I have this conversation with my friends, but we run into this political issue everywhere we go. So how do you make change outside of the political structure, and what does that look like?
Last night at Fairmont Lutheran Church, the same question was asked by a woman about your age, which is, to me, this is the great sign. So younger people are saying, okay, that's what I want to do. How do I do it? And so that's the kind of conversation that we have back home now. Every week we have, Tim coordinates our messaging meeting and campaigns. What are the campaigns? We're asking, how can we resource and encourage people in their own lives and their own communities to act on the basis of what they believe. How do we then connect them to each other? And then how do we try to focus some of this where it'll make a difference? For example, on the deficit debt crisis battle last summer, there was huge things being decided in terms of what's going to happen to poor people. And Tim actually had this thought one day. He said, let's and you know, we're having religious leaders sign letters, but let's ask pastors. So we got 1,000 pastors to sign a statement, and it was a full-page ad in Politico called "Listen to the Pastors," who said, "This is what's going to happen to our people in our parishes if this is decided against low-income people. Here's what will happen. Pastors normally don't have a voice in Washington, D.C. or national politics. You know, they just watch it and get frustrated by it. And so we just did a very small thing to help lift up their voice. And their voice was a different voice, and frankly, I think listened to more than just the usual religious leaders signing statements and all the rest. So how do you get people to act in new ways in their own communities? How do you get them to find each other in doing so? And then how do you help them lift up their voices in ways that make a difference on decision making? So there's no easy answers. I just know that, for example, the voting rights division of the Justice Department in Mississippi was the Johnson administration's portal to the civil rights movement. I mean, Bob Moses was down there in Mississippi. And I talked to people who were doing that work in justice. They were right out of Harvard, and they were lawyers, and they got, you know, John Doerr. They were down there, and that was their portal to the movement. And the King-Johnson conversations came right out of that experience. Now, this White House doesn't even know that history, because I've asked. They don't even know its story. So when you ask, do you want to have portals to the movement? I think the answer, honestly, the first couple of years would have been, we don't even know that or need that. Now I think there's a feeling of, there's a need for some portals. So what are the portals? You know, what are the kind of connections? What are the relationships? And how do we get people to act as citizens and not just consumers? We politically act as consumers, not citizens. And politics is really advertising aimed at consumers. Ads, images, caricatures, demonizing fears. Who can we make afraid? Who can we make excited? And then we watch the advertising and say, okay, I'll buy this guy. And then we watch as consumers to see how our product does. We fold our arms and say, well, I'm disappointed. I wish they would. You know, that's not the response of citizens. Citizens act politically. They get involved, they get engaged, and they hold politics accountable. So what does it mean to think of ourselves, to move from consumers to citizens? And if a new generation starts that, then there's all kind of movement, strategic, what campaign, what issue can we raise? Tim and I were talking last night. What issues are the ones that we've raised here? What really might be possible to raise in this election campaign? I'm not sure yet. You know, Nick Kristof gets on Morning Joe. We got to raise, and Ariana and Nick, we got to raise Afghanistan as an issue. Nick says, he says, we're losing 1.5 members, service members every day in the war in Afghanistan. But of veterans coming home from those wars, we're losing them to suicide every 80 minutes. Something is terribly wrong. How do you raise that as an issue? We were staying up last night. I don't know. Which of these issues might we raise? But that's the question. How do citizens raise issues and not act like consumers in politics? Does that make sense? Thanks.
Dr. Wallis, thank you very much for your talk. I am very much in sympathy with your views on the political system and the state of the common good, and it's quite frankly depressing to try and follow it, although I still do. My question, though, is, and I certainly am in sympathy with what you seem to be saying about changing hearts, on a person-to-person basis and right. Building a sense of what's just in our communities and moving beyond that.
Right.
My concern, though, is we have a real election upon us, and it seems to me that it makes a difference which way it goes. When the question of how would Jesus vote came up, yikes! I mean, I'm half tempted to say that he would probably say, let the whirling dervishes whirl. We're gonna deal with what's going on in our communities. We're gonna deal with the powerless. We're gonna feed the hungry, and it doesn't really matter what happens on this macro level because these values are not affecting that anyway. And yet, that's one side of the argument, which would simply say it really doesn't matter who wins. But there's another part of me that says, in this election, it does matter who wins. And how do you address that question of dealing with the long view in terms of rebuilding values on a door-by-door, door-to-door basis, and then these macro battles that go on and are going to have a huge impact on which way our country moves?
Excellent question, and it was raised last night. Somebody said, I want to vote the way you're talking about, but I'm going to be faced with candidates. What do I do? Yeah. So what I said at the end, I said elections do matter. They can make a difference. I think whether we're going to be in a war with Iran is one difference that might be made in this election or not. How badly the poor are devastated. So that's exactly right. However, I think what I hear the kids saying, young people saying, sorry, my kids are kids, they're 9 and 13, these are young people. Some voted last time for a candidate in whom they put all of their hopes and dreams about change and reform. And now the danger is some of those young people, what's the unemployment rate for 18 to 25? Almost 50% a month. So they're living at home in the basement without a job. And it feels very different. So now do you disengage? Disengagement, as you described that, would be a serious mistake. Because as my brother, who runs the biggest sort of service providing organization in Detroit, you know what Detroit's like, you know what Cleveland's like. These decisions the governor makes in Detroit, in Michigan, or in Washington about what happens to Medicaid will just devastate all the people they're serving. So he's really critical of both sides, but he knows how bad things will get. So one way to put it is, you know, which choice or candidate will do the least damage to the people and the agendas you care about. I mean, I hate to be as cynical as that, but that's a fair question to ask. It does make a difference. What I'm trying to say, though, let's not look at politics as just what we do in November. How do we be citizens before the election and after it, and how do you raise things during an election that could be campaigns afterwards? You know, that's the crooked. Len, straighten this out for us.
Great to have you here again, Jim, and excellent as usual. I wanted to take you back just as we, I guess, are near winding up to the point you made about citizens and consumers, which I think is a critical one, right. And also Carrie's point, you know, which comes back to what do you do and how we move and how we organize. But I want to do it with a little different, you might say, emphasis, which obviously comes from those of us who are people of faith and work with and in faith communities. Right. So it seems to me movements, absolutely right, historically in our country have always influenced politics in major ways. Religion, prophetic religion, right, has always influenced those movements, exactly, up till now. And I think that's a question. I'm not sure where we're at on that. So I guess that's one thing where, you know, I'd like your thoughts. But what about the effect on religion, though, in terms of new bubblings, new movements, especially grassroots, which you're always close to and I know in touch with? Where do you see signs of hope of that coming from the religious community?
Right. Your first point, I think, needs to be lifted up. Virtually every reform movement in the history of this country had religion, people of faith, as an animating core of it. It's never just people of faith. But there wouldn't have been a civil rights movement without black churches. It just wouldn't have been. So, and the suffrage movements a long time ago, that was the case then too. Labor movements, abolition of slavery, all those movements. So we know that story. So the question, and that's exactly what our role ought to be. How do we lift up those movements? How do we provide what people of faith provide? Without Desmond Tutu, it would have been very different what happened in South Africa. You know, he provided, and he was the master of ceremonies at the inauguration of Nelson Mandela. You know, so that's the role I think that is the prophetic role. When we get squeezed into politics, in a partisan way, that's what takes away that prophetic role. That's what misshapes our faith. So how do we play that prophetic role is really the issue. You know, that's the challenge, and I think that's what young people are looking to us for. And if they see us doing that, I think some of them will say, maybe I should rethink this, and maybe I should engage this again, if they see us playing that kind of role. So I'll just really close with a story. I mean, when Martin King came back from winning the Nobel Peace Prize, he went to see Lyndon Johnson before he went back to Atlanta. And he won the prize because of Birmingham and gaining the Civil Rights Law. And he said, Mr. President, we need a Voting Rights Act. A Voting Rights Act. And Johnson, the master of realpolitik, says to the nation's moral leader, that's impossible. I've cashed in all my chits with the Southern senators to get the Civil Rights Law passed. I can't do that for you. I can't give you a Voting Rights Act. It'll take 5 or 10 years before we can get a Voting Rights Act. King said, we can't wait 5 or 10 years. If we can't vote in the South, we can't even enforce the Civil Rights Law. We have to vote in the South. I'm sorry, he said, I'd like to, I can't do it. King was never one to quit or withdraw or whine or walk away. He went and organized in a place that nobody heard of back then called Selma. And John Lewis, now a member of Congress, was beaten almost to death on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on that bloody Sunday. And then Abraham Joshua Heschel came down, and Martin King, and the clergy became engaged as never before on the march from Selma to Montgomery. And the clergy was leading the way. The rabbi and the black Baptist preacher leading the way, and the whole world was watching. And we had a Voting Rights Act in 5 months. Not 5 years, 5 months, because we did what you said we ought to do. That's our role. And if we get back to that, I think not only will change politics, but a new generation will start to say, maybe there's something I should be thinking about here in regard to this thing called faith. Thank you so much for today.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a special encore speakers forum featuring Jim Wallis, Chief Executive Officer of Sojourners. Thank you very much, Mr. Wallis. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.